If you've walked into a fish store recently, you've probably seen these 10 fish sitting in the showpiece tanks, looking absolutely stunning under the lights. They're all over social media. Every aquascaping influencer seems to own one, and the employee behind the counter is probably going to recommend at least one of them to you today. But here's the problem. Most of these fish are not beginner-friendly. Some of them will outgrow your tank in a year. Some of them will die from water conditions you didn't even know you needed to monitor. And some of them are only trending because they photograph well, not because they're actually good choices for a first-time or intermediate fish keeper in the US. So in this video, we're going through 10 categories of aquarium fish, the hyped-up pick everyone wants, why it's actually a bad idea for most people, and the alternative that gives you almost the same look and experience without the heartbreak, the dead fish, or the $400 emergency tank upgrade. Let's get into it. 1. Schooling fish. Cardinal Tetras versus Ember Tetras or Black Neon Tetras. Cardinal Tetras get recommended constantly because a school of them, that electric blue stripe over a red belly, is one of the most photographed sights in the hobby. The problem is that a huge portion of Cardinal Tetras sold in US stores are still wild caught, imported from South America rather than captive bred. That matters because wild-caught fish go through a much harsher journey before they ever reach your tank, and they arrive already carrying more stress and a higher parasite load than farm-raised fish. In practice, this means Cardinal Tetras often have a noticeably higher mortality rate in the first few weeks after purchase, especially for beginners who haven't fully cycled their tank, or who buy the fish before their water parameters are completely stable. They're also genuinely more sensitive to fluctuations in temperature and water chemistry than many other tetras, which is a rough combination for someone still learning how to manage a nitrogen cycle. Ember Tetras and Black Neon Tetras solve most of this. Ember Tetras are small, warm, orange-red, tank-bred in huge numbers, and genuinely hardy, tolerating the kind of minor water fluctuations that would stress out a cardinal. They school beautifully, and their color practically glows under a planted tank's lighting. Black Neon Tetras give you a very similar silhouette and shimmering stripe to a neon or Cardinal Tetra, but with a hardier, more beginner-forgiving temperament and a striking black and silver look that stands out in a mixed community. 2. Algae Eater. Common Pleco versus Bristlenose. Pleco. The common pleco is probably the single most missold fish in the entire hobby, and it happens because of one specific moment. A beginner walks in, sees a 2-inch armored catfish sucking algae off the glass, and an employee says, "Get one of these for algae control." Nobody mentions that this same fish can grow to 12, 18, even 24 inches in the right conditions, because common plecos are actually a type of catfish that, in the wild, live in massive rivers, not 10-gallon starter tanks. Once a common pleco starts approaching a foot in length, the problems stack up fast. It produces an enormous amount of waste for its size, enough that some owners describe it as having a second full-grown fish's bioload sitting in the tank. It also becomes far less interested in eating algae as an adult, shifting toward a much broader, meatier diet, and larger specimens will sometimes rasp on the slime coats of slower-moving tank mates like goldfish or larger cichlids, causing sores. The fix here is simple. Buy a bristlenose pleco instead. Bristlenose plecos max out around 4 to 5 inches, which means they're actually compatible with the 20 to 40-gallon tanks that most beginners own. They're just as effective, arguably more effective, at grazing algae off glass, decor, and driftwood while they're young and small, which is exactly the phase when most people actually need algae control. They also breed readily in home aquariums if you want to get into that side of the hobby, and their stubby, spiky-faced look is honestly more interesting up close than a plain, common pleco. 3. Monster fish. Red-tail catfish versus bichir. The red-tail catfish shows up constantly in monster fish content because it looks incredible. Sleek gray body, bold white lateral line, a bright orange-red tail, and a face full of long whiskers. Sold as a 2 or 3-inch juvenile for a few dollars, it looks like a completely reasonable centerpiece fish. It is not. Red-tail catfish are one of the most notorious tank busters in the hobby, capable of growing well over 3 feet in captivity, with some specimens pushing 4 feet or more, and they can weigh over 100 pounds. Housing an adult red-tailed catfish properly generally requires a custom pond-size setup, something in the range of many hundreds of gallons, which is simply outside what almost any home aquarist can provide. Beyond size, they're aggressive, predatory feeders that will eat any tank mate small enough to fit in their mouth, and their mouths get very large very quickly. Filtration for a fish this size is a serious ongoing cost, and because so few people can actually accommodate a full-grown red-tailed catfish, they're one of the most commonly surrendered regret purchases at public aquariums and rescue groups across the U.S. If the appeal is that prehistoric monster fish look, a bichir is a far more realistic option. Bichirs are ancient, eel-bodied, armored fish with a genuinely dinosaur-like appearance, and depending on species, they stay in a much more manageable range, generally under 2 feet, with several popular species closer to 12 to 16 inches. They're nocturnal ambush predators, so they bring real monster fish personality, low, slow, deliberate movement without needing a pond in your backyard. You will still want to research the specific species carefully, since sizes and temperaments vary, and a secure lid is a must because bichirs are notorious tank jumpers. 4. Centerpiece fish. Flowerhorn versus pearl gourami. The flowerhorn is one of the most visually dramatic fish in the entire hobby. A huge, bulging cock on the forehead, wild, iridescent coloring, and a bold, almost dog-like personality where the fish recognizes its owner. It's also, almost entirely, a human-engineered hybrid, not a naturally occurring species, and that origin comes with real downsides. Flowerhorns are famously extremely aggressive, to the point where they typically cannot be kept with any tank mates at all and need a solitary tank of their own. That aggression isn't occasional, it's the defining trait of the fish. Flowerhorns will attack anything sharing their space, including much larger fish, and they're known to rearrange, dig up, and destroy planted decor. Because they're a hybrid bred specifically for exaggerated features, there's also real variability and controversy around the breeding practices behind them, and buyers often pay a premium for quality head growth or coloring that isn't guaranteed to develop the way pictures suggest. The pearl gourami is a much more community-friendly way to get a genuine centerpiece fish. It has a beautiful pearlescent, almost lace-like pattern across its body, a peaceful temperament that works well with Tetras, Corydoras, and other calm community fish, and a labyrinth organ that lets it breathe atmospheric air, making it noticeably hardier and more tolerant of imperfect water conditions than a lot of other centerpiece options. It still has presence, males develop a lovely orange throat, and can be territorial toward each other. 5. Bottom dweller. Chinese algae eater versus Corydoras. The Chinese algae eater is another classic case of a fish sold for what it does as a baby, not what it becomes as an adult. Young Chinese algae eaters are genuinely decent at grazing algae, which is exactly why store employees hand them to beginners. The issue is that as they mature, usually past the 4 to 6 inch mark, their diet and behavior shift dramatically, and algae stops being their main interest. Adult Chinese algae eaters become territorial, and they develop a specific, well-documented bad habit, using their sucker-like mouth to latch onto the sides of slower-moving fish, like fancy goldfish or flat-bodied fish, and rasping at their slime coat, sometimes hard enough to cause open sores or infection. On top of that behavioral problem, they simply become poor algae eaters as adults, so you lose the one benefit that justified buying them in the first place, while keeping a larger, more aggressive fish in the tank. Corydoras catfish are the far better bottom dweller choice, and they're one of the most consistently recommended fish in the entire hobby for good reason. They stay small, most species in the 2 to 3 inch range. They're peaceful with essentially every community fish, and they spend their time foraging through substrate for leftover food, which genuinely helps keep the bottom of the tank cleaner. They're also a schooling fish themselves, so keeping a small group of 5 or 6 gives you constant, entertaining activity along the substrate. 6. Shrimp companion. Angelfish versus honey gourami. Angelfish get recommended as a striking, elegant addition to almost any community tank, and their tall, graceful, arrow-shaped silhouette really is one of the most recognizable looks in freshwater fish keeping. But if your goal is a shrimp tank, or a tank where shrimp are meant to breed and thrive alongside your fish, angelfish are one of the worst possible choices you could make. Angelfish are cichlids, and cichlids are predatory by nature. Even a relatively calm, well-fed angelfish will typically view small dwarf shrimp, like Neocaridina or cherry shrimp, as food rather than tank mates, especially shrimplets, which are exactly bite-sized for an adult angelfish's mouth. It doesn't usually matter how well you feed the angelfish or how well you decorate the tank with shrimp hiding spots. A shrimp population living alongside angelfish will almost always decline over time as the fish picks them off one by one. If shrimp safety is genuinely the goal, the honey gourami is a far better centerpiece adjacent fish to build a community around. It stays small, generally under 2 inches. It's a peaceful, almost timid fish that has no real interest in hunting adult shrimp, and it brings warm honey orange to reddish coloring that stands out nicely against green planted backgrounds. Like other gouramis, it has a labyrinth organ, so it's forgiving of minor water quality issues, which is a nice bonus for a beginner still learning tank maintenance. 7. Predator. Oscar versus electric blue acara. The Oscar is one of the most personality-driven fish in the entire hobby. They recognize their owners. They can be trained to take food from your hand, and they'll rearrange their tank decor like a tiny, opinionated interior designer. It's easy to see why so many beginners fall for an Oscar at the store, where it's sold small, 3 or 4 inches, calm, and completely manageable looking. The problem is the same one that shows up again and again on this list: growth. Oscars regularly reach 12 to 16 inches in a home aquarium, and the generally accepted minimum tank size for a single adult Oscar is 75 gallons, with many experienced keepers recommending well beyond that, especially if you want a second Oscar or any tank mates. Oscars are also famously messy eaters and heavy waste producers, meaning filtration needs to be significantly oversized compared to what a beginner typically budgets for. They're intelligent and can be food aggressive, and because the electric blue acara offers a genuinely comparable big personality cichlid experience in a noticeably more manageable package. It has a stunning, almost iridescent blue-green body that catches light beautifully, and it shares that same intelligent, interactive cichlid personality that makes Oscars so popular, recognizing feeding time, investigating tank changes, and showing real character. But it typically tops out around 8 inches, meaning a 55 to 75 gallon tank is genuinely sufficient long-term. Rather than being an absolute minimum you'll likely need to exceed. It's also semi-aggressive rather than a true predator, so with the right tank mates, larger, sturdy fish, it can work in more of a community setting than an Oscar realistically can. 8. Showpiece fish. Discus versus German blue ram / Bolivian ram. Let's start with the fish that basically defines showpiece in the hobby, the discus. And look, it's easy to see why people want one. That round, plate-shaped body, the vivid patterns, the way a group of them glides through a planted tank. It's genuinely one of the most beautiful freshwater fish you can own. But discus are also one of the most demanding fish sold to casual buyers, and most new owners are not told that until the fish is already dying. Discus need warm water, typically 84 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than almost any other community fish, meaning you can't just toss them into a normal tropical setup with your Tetras and Corydoras. They also need soft, slightly acidic water, and they are extremely sensitive to ammonia, nitrite, and even small nitrate spikes. A water change schedule that a hardier fish would shrug off can send a discus into stress, which shows up as clamped fins, dark coloration, and refusal to eat. They're also picky, sometimes exclusive eaters, often needing live or frozen food before they'll touch flakes. And because they're sold small and cheap, Most buyers have no idea that a healthy adult setup really calls for a tall tank of 55 gallons or more, ideally a species-only or discus-focused community. If what you actually want is a colorful, personality-filled centerpiece Cichlid without the 5-star hotel water requirements, look at the German blue ram or the Bolivian ram instead. German blue rams give you that same jewel-toned, almost tropical reef look in a fish that tops out around 2 to 3 inches, meaning a planted 20 to 29 gallon tank is genuinely enough. They still want warm, stable water, so they're not a zero-effort fish, but they're dramatically more forgiving than discus and far cheaper to house properly. If you want something even hardier, the Bolivian ram is the move. 9. Nanotank fish. Goldfish versus White Cloud Mountain. Minnows goldfish end up in small tanks and bowls more than almost any other fish, largely because of decades-old assumptions that they're an easy, low-maintenance starter fish. In reality, goldfish are one of the worst possible choices for a small or nano tank, and the mismatch causes more early fish-keeping failures than almost any fish on this list. Goldfish are cold water fish, not tropical fish, which means they're frequently kept at the wrong temperature entirely, often in a heated tank meant for tropical species, which stresses them and shortens their lifespan. They also produce an exceptional amount of waste for their size, generally requiring 20 to 30 gallons per fish, sometimes more for fancy varieties, because ammonia builds up quickly without that volume of water to dilute it. In a small nanotank, that waste overwhelms the water chemistry fast, and beginners frequently see cloudy water, ammonia spikes, and stunted or sick fish within weeks. For an actual nanotank, White Cloud Mountain minnows are one of the best matches available. They're genuinely cold tolerant, meaning they don't even need a heater in a lot of home environments. They're small, schooling, extremely hardy, and they bring a subtle but attractive metallic shimmer with a red and white tail accent. If you want a bit more color and constant activity, Endler's livebearers are another excellent nano option. Small, prolific, and available in a wide range of vivid patterns, thriving in tanks as small as 5 to 10 gallons when stocked appropriately. 10. Betta alternative. Betta in the wrong setup versus the right community. Fit male betta fish are probably the most recognizable fish in American pet stores, sold in tiny cups with flowing, colorful fins, and for years they were marketed as a fish that could live in a bowl, a vase, or a tiny unfiltered container. That marketing is largely responsible for one of the most common beginner mistakes in the entire hobby: putting a betta into a setup that's fundamentally wrong for it, whether that's an unheated bowl, a vase with live plants and no filtration, or a community tank full of other brightly colored, long-finned fish. Bettas are naturally territorial and aggressive toward other bettas, and males in particular will often view other brightly colored or long-finned fish as rivals, leading to fin nipping, chasing, and stress on both sides. They are also tropical fish, needing stable warm water, generally around 76 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which a bowl or unheated vase simply cannot provide consistently, especially through a normal, fluctuating American home. A betta kept too cold becomes lethargic, stops eating properly, and becomes far more susceptible to illness. And a betta kept with fin-nipping tank mates or aggressive schooling fish spends its life stressed and physically damaged. The better path here isn't necessarily a different species, it's a different setup. A betta genuinely thrives in a properly heated, filtered tank of at least 5, ideally 10+ gallons, either housed alone as a stunning solo centerpiece, or paired carefully with calm, short-finned, bottom-dwelling tank mates like a small group of Corydoras or Nerite snails, which don't trigger its territorial instincts. If what you actually want is a peaceful, colorful community tank without any of that aggression management, that's when a fish like a honey gourami, Ember Tetra school, or Corydoras group, the alternatives already mentioned in this video, becomes the smarter foundation to build around.